The rain drummed against the windshield as David pulled the black luxury car into the circular driveway. He had been working as a private driver for the wealthy businessman Robert Harrison for almost 3 years now. It was a good job that paid well and came with respect. David took pride in his work, always on time, always professional, always dressed in his clean black suit that Tuesday evening started like any other. He had dropped off Mrs. Victoria Harrison at the Grand Ballroom downtown for one of her charity events. She was wearing an expensive blue dress and diamond jewelry that probably cost more than David made in a year. Mrs. Harrison was always polite to him, though she seemed distant and often looked stressed. The charity gala was supposed to end at 10 in the evening. David waited in the parking garage, reading a book to pass the time. His phone buzzed at exactly 10:15 with a text message asking him to come upstairs to pick up Mrs. Harrison. He straightened his tie, grabbed his keys, and walked into the fancy hotel lobby. The ballroom was still buzzing with well-dressed people holding wine glasses and talking in small groups. David spotted Mrs. Harrison near the back of the room. She looked upset about something and was speaking quietly but intensely with another woman. When she saw David approaching, she quickly ended her conversation and walked over to him. "We need to leave right now," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. David nodded and followed her outside to where the car was parked. Something seemed off about Mrs. Harrison that night. She was walking unsteadily and seemed agitated. David had worked for wealthy families long enough to know when to ask questions and when to just do his job quietly. Tonight felt like a night. To stay quiet, the drive back to the Harrison mansion usually took about 20 minutes through the city. David always took the same route down Main Street through the business district, and then up the winding road to the exclusive neighborhood where his employer lived. Mrs. Harrison sat in the back seat, staring out the window and occasionally checking her phone. About halfway through the drive, she suddenly spoke up. "David, can you turn up the music?" she asked. Her voice sounded strange, almost nervous. David reached over and adjusted the volume on the classical music station that Mrs. Harrison preferred. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When they arrived at the Harrison home, David got out and opened the car door for Mrs. Harrison, just like he always did. She stepped out of the car, thanked him, and walked toward the front door of the massive house. David watched to make sure she got inside safely, then drove the car to the garage and locked it up for the night. He went home to his small apartment, heated up some leftover pizza, and watched the news before going to bed. It had been a normal evening, or so he thought. David had no way of knowing that his entire life was about to change forever. The next morning, David woke up to his phone ringing. It was Mr. Harrison, and he sounded angry. "David, I need you to come to the house immediately," his boss said before hanging up. David felt confused and worried. In 3 years of working for the Harrison family, Mr. Harrison had never called him with such urgency. David quickly got dressed and drove to the Harrison mansion. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed 2 police cars parked outside. His heart started beating faster. Had there been a break-in? Was someone hurt? He walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Mr. Harrison answered the door himself, which was unusual. Normally, the housekeeper would greet visitors. Mr. Harrison looked tired and stressed. Behind him, David could see 2 police officers standing in the fancy living room. "David," Mr. Harrison said quietly, "these officers need to speak with you." "About what happened last night?" David felt completely confused. "What happened last night, sir? Is everything okay?" One of the police officers, a tall man with gray hair, stepped forward. "Are you David Thompson?" He asked. "Yes, sir, that's me. We need to ask you some questions about your interaction with Mrs. Victoria Harrison yesterday evening. Can you tell us exactly what happened when you drove her home from the charity event?" David explained the evening exactly as it had happened. He told them about picking up Mrs. Harrison from the ballroom, the quiet drive home, and dropping her off safely at the house. The officers listened carefully and wrote down everything he said. "Did anything unusual happen during the drive?" The second officer asked. "No, sir. It was completely normal. Mrs. Harrison seemed a bit tired, but that's not unusual after a long evening. I drove straight home using my regular route." The officers looked at each other, and David noticed they seemed uncomfortable. The gray-haired officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Harrison has made a serious accusation against you. She claims that during the drive home last night you made inappropriate advances toward her and attempted to assault her." David felt like the world had stopped spinning. He couldn't process what he was hearing. "That's not true," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That never happened. I would never do anything like that." "We understand this is serious," the officer continued. "We're going to need you to come down to the police station to answer some more questions." David looked at Mr. Harrison, hoping to see some sign of support or understanding. Instead, his employer looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Mr. Harrison," David said desperately, "you know me. You know I would never do anything like this. I've worked for your family for 3 years. I've always been professional and respectful." Mr. Harrison finally looked at him, and David could see the conflict in his eyes. "I don't know what to believe right now, David. My wife is very upset, and she's making serious claims. I have to support her." David felt his legs getting weak. This couldn't be happening. He was an honest person who had worked hard his entire life. He had served in the military for 4 years before becoming a driver. He had never even gotten a speeding ticket, let alone committed any kind of crime. "Sir, I promise you on everything I hold dear, I did not do what she's saying. There has to be some kind of mistake." The police officers were patient but firm. "We need you to come with us now, Mr. Thompson. You can call a lawyer from the station." As David was led to the police car, he saw Mrs. Harrison watching from an upstairs window. Even from a distance, he could see that she looked upset. But there was something else in her expression that he couldn't quite understand. It almost looked like guilt. The ride to the police station felt like the longest 20 minutes of David's life. He kept trying to figure out what could have happened. Had Mrs. Harrison misunderstood something? Was she confused about the events of the evening? Maybe she had been drinking at the charity event and her memory was unclear at the police station. David was fingerprinted and photographed. He was allowed to call a lawyer, but he couldn't afford an expensive attorney. The public defender who was assigned to his case seemed overwhelmed and didn't have much time to spend on his situation. The story hit the local news that same evening. "Billionaire's wife accuses driver of assault" was the headline that appeared on every news channel and website. David's full name and photo were broadcast across the city. The story painted him as a trusted employee who had betrayed his employer's faith and attacked a vulnerable woman. David sat in his apartment that night, watching his life being destroyed on television. His phone kept ringing with calls from reporters wanting to interview him. His neighbors were staring at him when he walked to his car. Everything he had worked for was falling apart because of an accusation that simply wasn't true. But the worst part was the doubt he saw in people's eyes. Even some of his closest friends seemed unsure about his innocence. After all, why would a wealthy, respected woman like Mrs. Harrison lie about something so serious? What could she possibly gain from making false accusations against her driver? David didn't know the answers to these questions yet. He had no idea that this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. All he knew was that his simple, honest life had been turned upside down in a single day, and he had no idea how to fight back against such powerful accusations. The weeks following the accusation felt like living in a nightmare that David couldn't wake up from. Every morning, he hoped that somehow this would all turn out to be a terrible mistake that could be easily fixed. But each day brought new challenges. That made his situation worse. The legal process moved faster than David had expected. His public defender, a tired-looking woman named Ms. Rodriguez, explained that the case against him was strong in the eyes of the law. Mrs. Harrison had given a detailed statement to the police. She claimed that during the drive home, David had made inappropriate comments and then stopped the car to attempt an assault. "But that's completely false," David told his lawyer during one of their brief meetings. "I never stopped the car. I drove straight home using the same route I always take." There are probably security cameras along the way that could prove this. Ms. Rodriguez looked at him with sympathy but also with the weariness of someone who had heard similar claims many times before. David, I believe you, but proving your innocence is going to be very difficult. Mrs. Harrison is a respected member of the community. Her husband has significant influence in this city. The prosecutor is going to push for a conviction. David learned that the Harrison family had hired one of the most expensive law firms in the state to support their case. Meanwhile, his overworked public defender had dozens of other cases to handle. The difference in resources was obvious and terrifying. The media attention grew bigger every day. Local news stations ran the story repeatedly, always showing David's photo next to headlines about the trusted driver who betrayed his employer. Social media was even worse. People who had never met David were calling him a predator and demanding that he be locked up immediately. His phone never stopped ringing with calls from reporters. They wanted to interview him to get his side of the story. But Ms. Rodriguez had warned him not to speak to any media. Anything you say can be twisted and used against you in court, she explained. The best thing you can do right now is stay quiet and let me handle this. But staying quiet felt impossible when his entire reputation was being destroyed every single day. David had to watch as local news reporters stood outside his apartment building, describing him as a dangerous person who had attacked an innocent woman. His neighbors started avoiding him in the hallways. Some even crossed the street when they saw him coming. The worst part was losing his job, not just with the Harrison family, but everywhere else he tried to work. Word spread quickly in the small community of private drivers and security personnel. No wealthy family wanted to hire someone who had been accused of assault. Even regular driving jobs became impossible once employers ran background checks and saw the pending charges. David's savings started disappearing quickly. Legal fees, even with a public defender, were expensive. There were court costs, fees for copying documents, and money needed for basic investigation work. His small apartment became harder and harder to afford as the weeks went by without any income. His girlfriend Lisa had stood by him at first. She knew David well and believed completely in his innocence. But as the weeks turned into months, the pressure became too much for her to handle. Her friends started asking uncomfortable questions. Her family worried that she was making a mistake by staying with someone who was facing such serious charges. "I know you didn't do this," Lisa told him one evening as they sat in his apartment, "but I can't handle the stress anymore. Every time we go out, people stare at us. My boss at work has been making comments about my choice in men. I feel like I'm drowning." David understood, but it still felt like another piece of his life was being ripped away. "I don't want you to suffer because of something I didn't do," he told her. I really need your support right now. You're one of the few people who still believes in me," Lisa started crying. "I do believe in you, but I also have to think about my own life and my career. I'm sorry, David. I just can't do this anymore." After Lisa left, David felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. His family lived in another state and couldn't afford to help him with money or legal support. His few close friends gradually stopped calling. Some believed in his innocence but didn't want to be associated with the scandal. Others seemed uncertain about what to believe. The legal pressure kept building. The prosecutor, an ambitious young man who seemed to enjoy the media attention, offered David a plea deal. If he would plead guilty to a reduced charge, he could avoid a trial and get probation instead of prison time. 5 years of probation, mandatory counseling, and community service, Ms. Rodriguez explained. You would have to register as an offender. But you wouldn't go to prison, David was horrified. But I didn't do anything wrong. If I take this deal, everyone will think I'm guilty. It will follow me for the rest of my life. I understand how you feel, his lawyer said. But if we go to trial and lose, you could face 10 to 15 years in prison. The jury will see a wealthy, respected woman testifying against a working-class man with no resources to defend himself properly. It's a very risky situation. The decision kept David awake at night. How could he admit to something he didn't do? But how could he risk spending the best years of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit? The uncertainty was eating away at his mental health and his hope for the future. Meanwhile, the Harrison family seemed to be thriving. David saw news reports about Mr. Harrison's business expanding into new markets. Mrs. Harrison appeared at several charity events, where she was praised for her bravery in speaking out against her alleged attacker. She even gave an interview to a women's magazine about the importance of believing assault victims. David felt sick watching these reports. How could someone lie so convincingly? How could Mrs. Harrison look into cameras and talk about trauma? That had never happened? He started to wonder if maybe she actually believed her own story. Maybe something had happened to her that night, but she was confused about who was responsible. As the weeks passed, David's life got smaller and smaller. He had to move out of his apartment and into a tiny room in a boarding house in a rough part of town. The room was barely big enough for a bed and a small table. He could hear his neighbors fighting through the thin walls, and the building smelled like cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. Finding work became nearly impossible. Even jobs at fast food restaurants and gas stations turned him down once they learned about the charges against him. Finally, he found work doing night shifts at a warehouse, loading trucks and moving boxes. It was hard physical labor that paid minimum wage, but it was the only job he could get. His coworkers at the warehouse mostly left him alone. Some had their own legal problems and understood what it was like to be judged by society. But even there, David felt the weight of his situation. He was an educated man who had served his country and worked hard his entire life, now reduced to barely surviving on minimum wage while fighting charges for something he didn't do. The stress was affecting his health. David lost weight because he couldn't afford to eat well. He had trouble sleeping because his mind wouldn't stop racing with worry about the future. Some days he felt so overwhelmed that he could barely get out of bed. The preliminary hearings continued, and each one brought more bad news. The prosecutor had found people willing to testify that David had seemed too friendly with Mrs. Harrison in the past. These were small interactions that had seemed perfectly normal at the time, but were now being twisted to support the accusation against him. David's lawyer kept pushing for the plea deal. "I've seen cases like this before," she told him. "When it's your word against someone with that much money and influence, juries tend to believe the wealthy person. I know it's not fair, but it's the reality of our justice system." As the trial date approached, David realized that his old life was completely gone. The man who had taken pride in his professional appearance and his reputation was now just trying to survive each day. He wondered if he would ever be able to rebuild his life, even if he somehow proved his innocence. The weight of the false accusation had crushed everything he had worked for, and he was beginning to understand that even if he eventually won in court, the damage to his life might be permanent. But deep down, a small flame of determination still burned. He refused to give up completely, even though everything seemed hopeless. 5 years had passed since David's world collapsed, and those years felt like a lifetime. He had eventually taken the plea deal, unable to risk decades in prison fighting a system that seemed stacked against him. The guilty plea haunted him every single day, but it had kept him out of jail and given him a chance to slowly rebuild some kind of life. David now lived in a small apartment above a corner store in the old part of town. It wasn't much, but it was clean and quiet, and the rent was something he could afford on his current income. He worked 2 jobs now, delivering food during lunch hours and stocking shelves at a grocery store in the evenings. Neither job paid well, but together they were enough to survive. The hardest part wasn't the money or the work. It was the constant reminder that he was living under a cloud of guilt for something he had never done. Every time he filled out a job application, he had to check the box asking about criminal convictions. Every time someone ran a background check, they would see his record and make assumptions about who he was as a person, but David had found ways to cope and even help others. He started volunteering at a legal aid clinic on weekends, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers navigate the complicated court system. Many of the people who came to the clinic were in situations similar to his working-class people facing charges they couldn't properly defend against. "You understand what we're going through?" an older man named Carlos told him one Saturday afternoon. Carlos was facing charges for a car accident that he swore wasn't his fault. Most lawyers look at us like we're just another case number, but you've been where we are. David found purpose in this work. He couldn't practice law himself, but his experience with the legal system, painful as it was, had taught him things that could help others. He learned how to research cases, how to find witnesses, and how to organize evidence. It felt good to use his knowledge to help people who were struggling. During one of these volunteer sessions, David met someone who would change everything. Rebecca Chun was an investigative journalist who had come to the legal aid clinic to research a story about problems in the public defender system. She was in her 30s, with sharp eyes and an energy that made people want to talk to her. Rebecca watched David helping clients and was impressed by his knowledge and dedication. After the clinic closed that day, she approached him. "You seem to know a lot about the legal system for someone who isn't a lawyer," she said with a friendly smile. David was hesitant to share his story. Over the years, he had learned to be careful about who he trusted with the details of his case. But something about Rebecca made him feel like she would listen without judging him. They went to a small coffee shop nearby, and David told her everything. He explained about his job with the Harrison family, the accusation, the media attention, and his decision to take the plea deal. Rebecca listened carefully, asking detailed questions and taking notes. "Have you ever tried to investigate what really happened that night?" Rebecca asked. David shook his head. "I couldn't afford to hire investigators when I was going through the case. And after I took the plea deal, everyone told me to just move on and try to rebuild my life." Rebecca leaned forward, looking interested. "I've been investigating wealthy families in this city for years. There are often stories behind the public image that people don't know about. Would you be open to me looking into your case?" David felt a mix of hope and fear. Hope that maybe someone could finally uncover the truth, but fear that digging into the past might make his life even harder. "What would you be looking for?" he asked. "Inconsistencies in the story. Other people who might have information about what really happened. Patterns of behavior that might explain why this accusation was made." Rebecca paused and looked at him seriously. "I can't promise anything, but I've seen cases where the truth comes out years later." Over the next few weeks, Rebecca started her investigation quietly. She began by researching the Harrison family's history and their business dealings. What she found was interesting. Mr. Harrison's company had been involved in several lawsuits over the years, mostly related to employee disputes and contract disagreements. More importantly, Rebecca discovered that the Harrison family had a pattern of staff turnover that seemed unusual. In the 5 years since David's case, they had fired or lost more than a dozen employees. Some had left for normal reasons, but others had departed under circumstances that seemed suspicious. Rebecca reached out to some of these former employees, being careful not to reveal exactly why she was asking questions. She told them she was researching workplace conditions in wealthy households for a general story about domestic workers. The first few people she contacted didn't want to talk. They seemed nervous about discussing their time with the Harrison family, even years later. But eventually, Rebecca found someone willing to share their experience. Patricia was a former housekeeper who had worked for the Harrisons for 2 years before being suddenly fired. She agreed to meet Rebecca at a restaurant far from the upscale neighborhood where the Harrisons lived. "I always wondered what happened to that driver," Patricia said when Rebecca carefully brought up David's case. "He seemed like such a nice, professional man. I never believed he could do what they said he did." Patricia told Rebecca that she had been fired shortly after David's case for what Mrs. Harrison claimed was stealing jewelry. But Patricia insisted she had never taken anything from the house. She said she believed she was fired because she had overheard conversations that Mrs. Harrison didn't want anyone to know about. "Mrs. Harrison had problems," Patricia said quietly. "She was taking pills, not just the ones her doctor gave her. And she would have people over to the house when Mr. Harrison was traveling for business. Male friends who definitely weren't just social visitors, if you know what I mean." Rebecca asked if Patricia would be willing to go on the record with these statements. Patricia shook her head firmly. "I signed papers when I was fired. They said I couldn't talk about anything that happened in their house or they would sue me for everything I had. I can't risk that. But Patricia did give Rebecca the names of other former employees who might be willing to talk. She also mentioned something that made Rebecca's investigation take a new direction. There was a security company that installed cameras around the Harrison property about a year before that poor driver was accused, Patricia said. I remember because they were very careful about where the cameras could and couldn't point, Mrs. Harrison was very specific about wanting to avoid certain areas being recorded. Rebecca left the meeting with more questions than answers, but she felt like she was finally on the right track. She spent the next several weeks tracking down the security company and learning about the camera system at the Harrison house. What she discovered was fascinating. The security system had indeed been installed about a year before David's case. The cameras covered the main entrances to the house and parts of the driveway, but there were deliberate gaps in coverage that seemed designed to create private areas where activities wouldn't be recorded. Rebecca also found the company that had provided the car service route optimization for the Harrison family's drivers. This company kept GPS records of all trips taken by their clients' vehicles. If David's car had made any unscheduled stops or detours the night of the alleged incident, there would be a record of it. Getting access to these records required legal help, but Rebecca had connections with lawyers who specialized in freedom of information requests. It took several months of paperwork and legal pressure, but eventually they were able to obtain the GPS records from David's route that night. The records showed exactly what David had always claimed. His car had traveled directly from the hotel to the Harrison house with no stops, no detours, and no significant delays. The timestamp showed that the trip had taken exactly 22 minutes, which was normal for that route at that time of night. When Rebecca showed these records to David, he felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that there was finally concrete proof of his innocence, but anger that this evidence could have been obtained years earlier if anyone had bothered to look for it. This proves I'm telling the truth, David said, staring at the GPS printout. I drove straight home, just like I always said. Rebecca nodded, but she looked thoughtful. This is good evidence, but it's not enough by itself. We need to understand why Mrs. Harrison made this accusation in the first place. There has to be more to this story. As Rebecca continued her investigation, she started to uncover a pattern that was even more disturbing than she had expected. The Harrison family hadn't just destroyed David's life. They appeared to have been systematically silencing employees who had witnessed things they weren't supposed to see. David realized that his case might not have been an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of abuse of power. For the first time in 5 years, he began to believe that justice might actually be possible. Rebecca's investigation started to pick up speed as more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. She had spent months carefully building trust with former Harrison employees, and finally, people were starting to talk. Each conversation revealed new details that painted a disturbing picture of what had really been happening in the Harrison household. The breakthrough came when Rebecca managed to contact Miguel, a former gardener who had worked for the Harrison family for almost 4 years. Unlike the other employees, Miguel hadn't signed any non-disclosure agreements when he left, because he had quit rather than being fired. Miguel agreed to meet Rebecca at a park near his current workplace. He was a quiet man in his 50s who spoke carefully and thoughtfully about his experiences. When Rebecca explained that she was investigating David's case, Miguel's expression grew serious. I remember that driver, Miguel said. He was always respectful, always professional. When I heard what happened to him, I knew something was wrong. I had been working in that house long enough to see things that made me uncomfortable. Miguel told Rebecca that he had witnessed Mrs. Harrison's behavior firsthand on multiple occasions. He described seeing her meeting with men at the house when her husband was away on business trips. He also talked about finding empty pill bottles hidden in various places around the property. One time, I was working near the house when I heard her screaming at someone on the phone, Miguel explained. She was very upset, talking about money and threatening to destroy someone's reputation. This was just a few weeks before that poor driver was accused. More importantly, Miguel remembered the specific night when David was supposed to have committed the assault. I was working late that evening, finishing some landscaping work near the front of the house. I saw the car arrive and watched the driver open the door for Mrs. Harrison. She got out of the car, but she seemed very unsteady. The driver waited until she was safely inside, then drove to the garage. Nothing unusual happened at all. Rebecca felt her heart racing as she listened to Miguel's account. Here was an eyewitness who could confirm David's version of events. But Miguel explained why he had never come forward before. A few days after the accusations were made, Mrs. Harrison called me into the house. She told me that if anyone asked me questions about that night, I should say I didn't see anything. She said it would be better for everyone, including me, if I just kept quiet. I needed the job, so I didn't say anything. Rebecca asked Miguel if he would be willing to give an official statement about what he had seen. Miguel hesitated for a long time before answering. I'm retired now, and my children are grown. I don't have to worry about the Harrison family anymore. If it will help that innocent man, then yes, I'll tell the truth. While Rebecca was gathering witness statements, she was also digging deeper into Mrs. Harrison's background. She discovered that Victoria Harrison had a history that very few people knew about. Before marrying into wealth, she had struggled with addiction and had been involved in several incidents that had been quietly covered up by her family's money. Rebecca found court records showing that Mrs. Harrison had been arrested twice in her 20s for prescription drug abuse, but both cases had been dismissed after her family's lawyers intervened. There were also medical records indicating that she had been in and out of rehabilitation facilities multiple times over the years. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Mrs. Harrison appeared to have a long history of manipulating situations to avoid consequences for her actions. The accusation against David seemed to fit this pattern perfectly. Rebecca also discovered something that made David's case even more compelling. She found security footage from businesses along the route that David had driven that night. A restaurant near the hotel had cameras that showed David's car leaving the hotel parking garage at exactly the time he had claimed. A gas station halfway home had footage showing the same car passing by without stopping. Most importantly, a traffic camera near the Harrison house had recorded David's car arriving at the expected time and driving directly to the garage. The timestamps on all these videos matched David's GPS records perfectly, creating an ironclad timeline that proved his innocence. When Rebecca showed this evidence to David, he felt overwhelmed with emotion. After years of living under a cloud of suspicion, seeing concrete proof of his innocence felt almost surreal. I always knew I was telling the truth, David said, his voice shaking slightly. But seeing it all laid out like this, knowing that other people will finally see what really happened, it's almost too much to believe. Rebecca had been working on the investigation for almost a year when she made another crucial discovery. Through her contacts in the legal community, she learned that David's original lawyer had been pressured not to investigate the case thoroughly. The lawyer, Ms. Rodriguez, had left the public defender's office shortly after David's case and now worked for a small private practice. When Rebecca approached her, Ms. Rodriguez was initially reluctant to discuss the case. But after learning about the new evidence, she agreed to meet privately. I've felt guilty about that case for years, Ms. Rodriguez admitted during their conversation. I knew we weren't doing enough to defend David, but I was overwhelmed with cases and didn't have the resources to investigate properly. Ms. Rodriguez revealed that shortly after taking David's case, she had received a call from someone claiming to represent the Harrison family's interests. The caller had suggested that pushing too hard on the case would not be good for her career or for the public defender's office. I was young and scared, Ms. Rodriguez explained. I convinced myself that the plea deal was the best option for David, but I knew deep down that we should have fought harder. I should have demanded that someone look for the security footage and GPS records. Ms. Rodriguez also revealed that there had been physical evidence that was never properly examined. Mrs. Harrison's clothing from that night had been collected by police, but no forensic testing had been done to look for evidence of an actual assault. The evidence had been stored in a police warehouse and could potentially still be tested with this new information. Rebecca realized that David's case was even stronger than she had thought. Not only was there evidence proving his innocence, but there was also evidence of misconduct in how the case had been handled originally. Rebecca decided it was time to approach a lawyer who could help David officially challenge his conviction. Through her journalism connections, she found attorney Michael Foster, an experienced criminal defense lawyer who specialized in wrongful conviction cases. Attorney Foster reviewed all the evidence that Rebecca had gathered and was immediately interested in taking the case. "This is one of the clearest cases of wrongful conviction I've ever seen," he told David during their first meeting. "With this evidence, we should be able to get your conviction overturned and pursue civil rights violations against everyone involved." Foster explained that they could file a motion to vacate David's conviction based on newly discovered evidence. The GPS records, security footage, and witness statements created a compelling case that David had been innocent all along, but Foster also warned David that the process wouldn't be easy or quick. "The Harrison family has powerful lawyers and a lot of influence. They're going to fight this every step of the way. And the district attorney's office won't want to admit they made such a serious mistake." David understood the challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt truly hopeful. He had spent 5 years living with the consequences of a crime he didn't commit, but now he had a real chance to clear his name and expose the truth. The legal team began preparing their case, organizing all the evidence and witness statements into a comprehensive presentation. They also started investigating other former Harrison employees who might have similar stories to tell. As word of the investigation began to spread quietly through legal circles, David noticed that his life was starting to change in small but meaningful ways. People who had believed in his innocence but hadn't been able to help before were now reaching out to offer support. Carlos, the man David had helped at the legal aid clinic, called to say that he had always known David was innocent and wanted to help however he could. Other volunteers at the clinic began treating David with even more respect as they learned about the evidence that was emerging. Rebecca continued her investigation, now working closely with attorney Foster to build the strongest possible case. She was determined to not only clear David's name, but also to expose the pattern of abuse and cover-ups that had allowed an innocent man to suffer for years while the real perpetrators faced no consequences. The stage was set for a legal battle that would challenge one of the city's most powerful families and test whether justice could truly prevail against wealth and influence. The day Rebecca's investigation became public changed everything for David and the Harrison family. Rebecca had spent months preparing her article, making sure every fact was verified and every source was protected. When the story was finally published in the city's largest newspaper, it sent shockwaves through the entire community. The headline read, "New evidence suggests wrongful conviction in high-profile assault case." The article detailed all the evidence Rebecca had uncovered, the GPS records, the security footage, the witness statements, and the pattern of suspicious employee dismissals. Most importantly, it presented a timeline that completely contradicted Mrs. Harrison's original accusations. Within hours of the article being published, David's phone started ringing constantly. News stations wanted interviews. Old friends who had distanced themselves were calling to apologize. Even his former girlfriend Lisa reached out, saying she had always hoped the truth would come out someday. But the most important call came from the district attorney's office. The current district attorney, Helen Martinez, had not been in office during David's original case. When she read Rebecca's article and reviewed the evidence, she immediately ordered her staff to reopen the investigation. "This appears to be a serious miscarriage of justice," District Attorney Martinez announced at a press conference the day after the article was published. "We will conduct a thorough review of this case and take appropriate action based on what we find." The Harrison family's response was swift and predictable. Their lawyers issued a statement denying all the allegations and claiming that the new evidence was being misinterpreted. They suggested that David was trying to use false evidence to escape, responsibility for his actions, but the Harrison family's credibility was already cracking. Other former employees, encouraged by Miguel's courage to speak out, began coming forward with their own stories. A former chef named Rosa described how she had been fired after accidentally walking in on Mrs. Harrison with a man who wasn't her husband. A handyman named Tony explained how he had been accused of stealing tools after he witnessed Mrs. Harrison hiding prescription pill bottles around the property. Each new revelation made the pattern clearer. Mrs. Harrison had been systematically silencing anyone who might expose her secrets, and David had been the most convenient scapegoat when she needed a major distraction from her own behavior. The legal process moved surprisingly quickly once District Attorney Martinez became involved. Attorney Foster filed a motion to vacate David's conviction, supported by all the evidence Rebecca had gathered. The motion included affidavits from Miguel and the other witnesses, expert analysis of the GPS and video evidence and documentation of the misconduct in David's original case. 3 weeks after the motion was filed, Judge Patricia Williams granted a hearing to review the case. Judge Williams was known for her fairness and her willingness to correct past mistakes when new evidence emerged. The hearing was held in the same courthouse where David had accepted his plea deal 6 years earlier. This time, though, the courtroom was packed with supporters, journalists, and curious observers who had followed the story in the news. David sat at the defendant's table with Attorney Foster, feeling nervous but hopeful. Across the room, he could see Mrs. Harrison sitting with her legal team. She looked older and more fragile than he remembered, and she avoided making eye contact with him. Attorney Foster presented the evidence methodically and clearly. He showed the GPS records proving that David's car had never stopped during the drive home. He played the security footage showing the car's arrival at the Harrison house at exactly the expected time. He presented Miguel's eyewitness testimony and the statements from other former employees. The most dramatic moment came when Foster revealed that the physical evidence from Mrs. Harrison's clothing had finally been tested. The forensic analysis showed no evidence of any kind of physical altercation or assault. In fact, the only unusual finding was the presence of prescription medications that had not been prescribed to Mrs. Harrison. Mrs. Harrison's lawyers tried to argue that the new evidence was not reliable and that David's original conviction should stand. But their arguments seemed weak and desperate compared to the mountain of evidence supporting David's innocence. The turning point came when District Attorney Martinez herself stood up to address the court. Your Honor, after reviewing all the evidence in this case, the state believes that a serious error was made in the original prosecution. We now believe that David Thompson is innocent of the charges against him, and we support his motion to vacate his conviction. Judge Williams took only a few minutes to make her decision. Based on the evidence presented today, it is clear that Mr. Thompson's conviction was based on false testimony and inadequate investigation. The conviction is hereby vacated, and all charges against Mr. Thompson are dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in applause as David felt tears streaming down his face. After 6 years of living under a cloud of guilt for a crime he didn't commit, he was finally free. Attorney Foster hugged him, and Rebecca, who had been sitting in the front row, gave him a thumbs up with tears in her eyes. But the story wasn't over yet. Within days of David's exoneration, the district attorney's office announced that Mrs. Harrison was being charged with perjury, filing false police reports, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and this time, her family's wealth and influence couldn't protect her from the consequences of her actions. Mrs. Harrison's trial became one of the most closely watched court cases in the city's history. During the proceedings, even more disturbing details emerged about her behavior over the years. Prosecutors presented evidence that she had made false accusations against at least 3 other employees before David, all of whom had been silenced. Through legal threats and financial settlements, the most shocking revelation came when Mrs. Harrison's own husband testified against her. Mr. Harrison, apparently tired of covering up his wife's behavior, admitted that he had suspected for years that his wife had lied about David. He revealed that on the night of the alleged assault, his wife had come home extremely intoxicated and upset about a phone call she had received from someone demanding money. "I wanted to believe my wife," Mr. Harrison testified, "but as time went on, I realized that David had been telling the truth all along. I should have spoken up years ago, and I deeply regret not having the courage to do the right thing." Mrs. Harrison eventually pleaded guilty to the charges against her. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay substantial compensation to David and the other employees whose lives she had damaged with her lies. The civil lawsuit that followed was settled quickly. The Harrison family agreed to pay David a significant amount of money to compensate for the years of suffering he had endured. More importantly for David, the settlement included a public apology acknowledging his complete innocence. David used part of his settlement money to establish a foundation dedicated to helping people who had been wrongfully convicted. He worked with Rebecca, who continued investigating similar cases, and with Attorney Foster, who provided legal services to people who couldn't afford proper representation. The foundation's first office was located in the same building where David had volunteered at the legal aid clinic. On the wall of his office, David hung a framed copy of the newspaper article that had started his journey toward justice. Below it was a photo of him with Carlos and the other people he had helped over the years. Lisa reached out to David several months after his exoneration. They met for coffee at the same shop where David had first told Rebecca his story. Lisa apologized for abandoning him during his darkest time, and while David appreciated her apology, he realized that too much had changed for them to go back to their old relationship. "I understand why you left," David told her. "I don't blame you for protecting yourself, but I'm not the same person I was 6 years ago. Going through this experience changed me in ways that I'm still figuring out." David had indeed changed. The shy, quiet driver who had once been focused only on doing his job well had become a confident advocate for justice. He spoke at law schools about the importance of thorough investigation and proper legal representation. He testified before the state legislature about reforms needed in the public defender system. Most importantly, David had found a sense of purpose that went beyond just clearing his own name. Every person he helped through his foundation was a reminder that justice was possible, even when it seemed hopeless. On the 6th anniversary of his original arrest, David stood in front of the courthouse where his conviction had been overturned. Rebecca was there with him, along with Miguel, Carlos, and dozens of other people whose lives had been touched by his story. "6 years ago, I thought my life was over," David told the crowd. "I believed that one person's lies had permanently destroyed everything I had worked for. But I learned that the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful people try to bury it. And I learned that there are good people in this world who will fight for justice, even when it's difficult and dangerous." As David looked out at the faces in the crowd, he realized that his suffering had not been meaningless. His story had led to reforms in the legal system,